What if the greatest danger facing Africa is not the absence of faith, but the way faith is sometimes placed in the hands of those who hunger for power? My name is Julius Malema. I was born on the 3rd of March 1981 in Seshego, Limpopo, South Africa. I grew up among working families. I saw mothers counting the last coins in their hands before deciding whether to buy bread, cooking oil, or transport to work. I saw men labor for many years in mines, factories, farms, and construction sites, yet never owned the land beneath the houses where their children slept. I saw communities surrounded by wealth, while the people living inside those communities remained poor. That contradiction stayed with me. It followed me into politics. I did not enter public life because I wanted people to call me a leader. I entered politics because I had seen too many Africans being told to wait. They were told to be patient. They were told to pray harder. They were told that suffering was part of God's plan. Yet while they were waiting, their land was being taken. Their minerals were being exported. Their labor was being underpaid. Their governments were being weakened by corruption. And their children were growing up without the opportunities that freedom had promised them. Let me make something clear before I continue. This is not an attack on God. It is not an attack on Jesus Christ. It is not an attack on the Bible, the church, or sincere believers who find courage, comfort, and hope in their faith. Across Africa, there are pastors, priests, religious leaders, and ordinary believers who feed hungry families, shelter abused women, educate children, visit prisoners, care for the sick, and defend the dignity of the poor. Their work must be respected. But respect for honest faith must never require silence about religious exploitation. I am speaking about those who use the name of God to silence the poor. I am speaking about those who protect failed politicians from accountability. I am speaking about those who turn the pulpit into an election platform. I am speaking about those who sell miracles to desperate families. I am speaking about those who teach Africans to submit to authority, but never teach them to question injustice. And I am speaking about powerful interests, both inside and outside Africa, that have learned how useful religion can become when it encourages obedience without demanding justice. Mmusi Maimane and I do not come from the same political tradition. We do not always agree on economics, government, leadership, or the path South Africa should follow. He comes from a Christian ministerial background. I come from a political tradition that places land, economic ownership, and African self-determination at the center of the struggle. But there is one question neither a politician nor a preacher should be allowed to avoid. Why does a society with so many churches, so many prayers, and so many leaders speaking about God still have so much corruption, unemployment, violence, and inequality? Why is a mother who cannot afford bread told to give away her final money as a seed of faith? Why does a man living in a mansion preach sacrifice to families living in shacks? Why can a politician steal from the people from Monday to Saturday, then sit in the front row of a church on Sunday and be introduced as a leader chosen by God? Why are Africans constantly told to look upward toward heaven while the land, mines, banks, energy systems, and corporations beneath their feet remain outside their control? Africa is not a continent without faith. Africa is a continent that must ask who controls the enormous power of that faith. Is it being used to liberate the people? Or is it being used to make them accept conditions that should never have been accepted? To understand how this happened, we must return to a time when the Bible arrived beside the colonial flag. Because long before miracles became a business, religion had already been drawn into a much older struggle over land, identity, obedience, and power. To understand the relationship between religion and power in Africa, we must return to history. We must return to a time when European ships arrived on African shores, carrying more than soldiers, traders, and administrators. They also carried Bibles. I do not say this to insult the Bible. I say it because history becomes dangerous when we remove the parts that make us uncomfortable. Not every missionary supported colonialism. Some built schools where children learned to read. Some established hospitals in communities that had no medical care. Some studied African languages and helped preserve them in writing. Some stood against slavery, racial oppression, and violent government. Some even paid a personal price for defending African people. We must acknowledge that truth. But we must also acknowledge another truth. In many parts of Africa, religion, colonial education, and imperial administration moved through the same doors. They did not always have identical intentions, but their actions often supported the same transformation of African society. One changed the way people prayed. Another changed the way people were governed. Another changed who controlled the land. And together, they weakened many of the systems that had given African communities identity, authority, and independence. In the years 1884 and 1885, European powers met in Berlin. African leaders were not seated at the table as equal partners. African families were not asked how their territories should be governed. Communities were divided by lines drawn on maps thousands of kilometers away. Kingdoms, languages, ethnic groups, trade routes, and cultural relationships were cut apart or forced together for the convenience of empire. Those lines did not come from God. They came from political ambition. They came from competition for land, minerals, labor, and strategic control. Yet colonial expansion was often described in moral language. It was presented as civilization. It was presented as education. It was sometimes presented as salvation. That is where the danger began. When domination is dressed in the language of goodness, the oppressed are encouraged to doubt their own resistance. They begin to ask whether defending their land is a sin. They begin to wonder whether obedience to foreign authority is the same as obedience to God. They are told that the ruler has been placed above them for a divine purpose. But who decided that the colonizer's authority was sacred? Who decided that African resistance was rebellion against heaven? I was taught to read the Bible, but I must also read the laws that removed land from African hands. In South Africa, the Natives Land Act of 1913 severely restricted where black people could own or occupy land. It did not simply change property law. It changed the future of generations. Families were pushed away from productive land. Communities lost economic independence. Workers were forced toward mines, farms, and cities where their labor could be controlled. Land dispossession was not an accidental side effect. It was a foundation of political and economic domination. A person without land becomes easier to control. A worker with no alternative becomes easier to exploit. A family that depends completely on the system that displaced it becomes afraid to challenge that system. And while these structures were being built, many Africans were also being taught that humility meant accepting their position. They were told that the meek would inherit the earth. But the people quoting that verse were often the same people controlling the earth. They told Africans to store treasures in heaven, while colonial companies stored gold, diamonds, and profit in European banks. They taught patience to people whose land had already been taken. They taught obedience to people whose humanity was being denied. This is why I say religion can become a technique of control when scripture is separated from justice. A verse can be used to comfort the suffering, but the same verse can be misused to prevent the suffering from confronting those responsible. The problem is not always the words. The problem is who chooses the words, who explains them, and what political purpose the explanation serves. On the 21st of March, 1960, people gathered in Sharpeville to protest against past laws. They were resisting a system that controlled the movement of black people in their own country. They were not asking for luxury. They were asking to move without being treated like criminals. Police opened fire. People were killed. Many were shot while running away. Where were the voices telling the government that obedience had limits? Where were those who preached that every human being carried equal dignity before God? Some religious leaders spoke out, others remained silent. And silence in the presence of organized injustice is never neutral. It protects the stronger side. Years later, on the 16th of June 1976, students in Soweto rose against the forced use of Afrikaans in their education. Young people refused to accept a school system designed to prepare them for permanent inferiority. They understood that language is more than a classroom tool. Language carries memory. Language carries culture. Language carries the way a people understand themselves. When a government tells a child that the language of power matters more than the language spoken by the child's mother, that government is not simply changing education. It is shaping identity. The students marched. The state answered them with violence. Once again, we must ask what religion meant in that moment. Did it mean telling the students to return home and obey? Or did it mean standing beside them and declaring that a system built on racial domination could not be morally legitimate? This is the conflict Africa has faced for generations. There were always two possible forms of religion. One form blessed the structure of power. The other stood with those crushed by that structure. One form told people to endure injustice. The other told the powerful that their authority would be judged by how they treated the poor. One form placed obedience above truth. The other placed truth above comfort. When I think about colonial history, I see two hands. One hand extends a Bible. The other hand signs documents controlling land, mines, railways, labor, and administration. The first hand speaks about salvation. The second hand calculates profit. The first hand promises dignity in the next world. The second hand removes dignity in this one. This image does not describe every missionary. It does not describe every church. But it describes a system in which religion was repeatedly used to give domination a respectable face. Colonialism was not created entirely by religion. It was driven by greed, military power, racial ideology, and economic competition. But religion was often recruited to make conquest appear moral. It taught the colonized to see the empire as a teacher. It taught them to see their own resistance as disorder. It told them that foreign rule had arrived to improve them. And when people believe that the hand controlling them is also the hand saving them, resistance becomes much more difficult. That is why liberation must begin with historical honesty. We cannot heal from a wound we are forbidden to examine. We cannot understand poverty without understanding dispossession. We cannot understand dispossession without understanding the political systems that justified it. And we cannot understand those systems without examining how religious language was sometimes used to protect them. Africa must not reject truth because truth makes some institutions uncomfortable. A sincere believer should not fear history. A strong faith should survive questions. Only a system built on manipulation demands silence. The lesson is not that Africans must choose between Christianity and African dignity. The lesson is that no faith should be allowed to demand the surrender of dignity. No spiritual teaching should require a people to accept stolen land. No preacher should tell the oppressed that challenging injustice is rebellion against God. And no government should be declared holy simply because its leaders sit inside a church. The colonial flag may have been lowered in many African countries, but the habits of colonial control did not disappear with it. They remained in institutions. They remained in economies. They remained in education. And in many places, they remained inside the African mind. That is where the next struggle begins. Because after the land was taken, another target came into view, the identity of the African person. After land is taken, the next target is often the mind. A people who remember who they are will eventually question those who rule them. A people who know their history will ask who stole their future. A people who respect their own language, culture, and ancestors will not easily accept the idea that they were born inferior. That is why domination has never depended on weapons alone. It also depends on teaching the oppressed to distrust themselves. Across Africa, many children entered schools where they were taught that European history was civilization, while African history was treated as darkness. They learned the names of foreign kings before they learned the names of African leaders. They studied distant wars, distant empires, and distant heroes, while the struggles of their own communities were reduced to a few pages. Their languages were described as unsuitable for science, government, or serious thought. Their names were considered difficult. Their hairstyles were called unprofessional. Their clothing was called primitive. Their traditional beliefs were dismissed as superstition. Their ancestors were sometimes described as evil. Before an African child could be accepted into the new system, that child was often expected to leave part of himself outside the door. This was not always written into law. Sometimes it appeared through small acts of shame. A teacher laughed at a child's name. A preacher mocked a family tradition. An employer rejected an African hairstyle. A school punished children for speaking their mother tongue. A young person learned that success meant sounding less African, dressing less African, and thinking less African. Over time, humiliation became normal. The victim began to participate in his own erasure. Let me be clear. The problem is not that an African chooses to become a Christian. The problem is not that an African chooses Islam. The problem is not that people adopt new ideas, learn new languages, or build relationships with cultures beyond their own. Human societies have always exchanged knowledge. Faith can cross borders without destroying dignity. But something becomes wrong when a person is told that acceptance requires self-hatred. No true faith should demand that a child feel ashamed of the name given by his grandmother. No, just God would require an African to imitate a European before being recognized as fully human. No religion should teach that heaven understands only foreign languages. No spiritual path should begin by telling people that everything their ancestors knew was worthless. Steve Biko understood that oppression survives inside the mind. He argued that the most powerful weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. That idea remains important because a person who has lost confidence in himself becomes easier to govern. He waits for permission. He looks outside his community for every answer. He believes that wisdom always comes from somewhere else. He may even defend the system that humiliates him because the system has taught him to measure himself by its standards. Robert Sobukwe spoke about African self-determination. He understood that liberation was not only about replacing white officials with black officials. It was about restoring African control over African life. It was about refusing to remain a guest in one's own country. Thomas Sankara demanded that Africans reject dependence and recover their dignity. He warned against the future in which African governments carried foreign flags in their minds, even after colonial flags had been lowered from public buildings. Patrice Lumumba became a symbol of Congo's struggle for real sovereignty. His story reminds us that political independence means little when foreign interests continue to control resources, governments, and national decisions. These leaders came from different countries and traditions, but they all understood a similar truth. A continent cannot be free if its people are trained to see themselves as inferior. That is why identity matters. Identity is not a costume. It is not a slogan. It is the memory that tells a people they existed before conquest. It is the knowledge that Africa had systems of trade, agriculture, governance, medicine, spirituality, art, and education long before colonial officials arrived. It is the confidence to learn from the world without disappearing into the world. It is the ability to accept a new faith without believing that everything African must be rejected. Desmond Tutu showed another possibility. He was a Christian leader, but he did not use Christianity to defend apartheid. He used moral language to confront it. He did not tell black South Africans to accept humiliation and wait for heaven. He spoke about human dignity in the present. He stood before power and told the powerful that racial domination could not be reconciled with justice. His life proves that Christianity in Africa does not have to become an instrument of cultural erasure. Faith can defend African humanity. Faith can stand against racism. Faith can expose political lies. Faith can remind the state that authority without justice becomes oppression. The question is not whether religion comes from Africa or from somewhere else. The question is what religion does when it enters an African life. Does it strengthen dignity or destroy it? Does it teach a person to love his neighbor while hating his own history? Does it make a woman feel equal before God, or does it demand silence from her? Does it honor the family, or does it divide families by calling every inherited custom demonic? Does it create moral courage, or does it create fear? I have seen Africans who can quote scripture in perfect English but cannot speak the language of their grandparents. I have seen children given foreign names because their parents feared that African names would make them appear less educated. I have seen young people taught to praise ancient civilizations elsewhere while knowing almost nothing about the civilizations of their own continent. This is not spiritual growth. It is historical amnesia, and a people without memory can be persuaded to accept almost anything. They can be told that their poverty is natural. They can be told that others are more qualified to manage their resources. They can be told that imported solutions are always better than local knowledge. They can be told that foreign approval matters more than African survival. The battle over identity is therefore connected to the battle over land, education, economics, and political power. When you convince people that they are inferior, you no longer need to control every decision by force. They begin to distrust their own leaders. They distrust their own institutions. They distrust their own languages. They distrust their own ability to build. And when they fail, they say Africa is the problem. They do not ask whether the system was designed to keep Africa dependent. We must refuse this mental prison. An African can read the Bible and still respect African history. An African can enter a church and still honor the sacrifices of his ancestors. An African can pray in English, isiZulu, Sesotho, Yoruba, Swahili, Shona, Arabic, or any other language. God does not become more powerful because a prayer sounds European. Truth does not become more sacred because it is spoken with a foreign accent. We do not need to choose between faith and identity. We need a faith that does not fear identity. We need education that does not treat African history as an appendix. We need churches that understand the communities in which they stand. We need leaders who can speak to the world without becoming ashamed of where they came from. And we need children who know that being African is not a defect to overcome. It is a history to understand. It is a dignity to protect. It is a responsibility to carry forward. But when people lose confidence in themselves, they become vulnerable to those who claim to possess special spiritual power. Their pain becomes a market. Their fear becomes a business. And their desperation becomes the foundation of a new kind of empire. Not an empire built by foreign soldiers. An empire built by false prophets, expensive miracles, and promises sold to the poor. There is a point where hope becomes vulnerable. It is the point where a person has tried everything. The rent is unpaid. The child is sick. The job application has been rejected again. The marriage is breaking apart. The family has no food. The hospital bill is growing. And every official institution has failed to offer an answer. That is the moment when a promise can become more powerful than evidence. It is also the moment when exploitation becomes easiest. Across Africa, there are sincere religious leaders who serve people with humility. They open their churches to the homeless. They feed children. They care for orphans. They visit prisoners. They support families after funerals. They help people recover from addiction. They offer shelter to women escaping violence. They create schools, clinics, and community programs where governments have failed. These people must not be placed in the same category as those who use religion for profit. But we must be honest about another reality. There are individuals who call themselves prophets, apostles, healers, and chosen messengers of God while building their power on the fear of desperate people. They say the blessing has a price. They say healing requires a payment. They say the prayer will only work after an offering. They say the miracle is waiting, but first the believer must prove faith through money. That is not faith. That is a transaction. And the person selling the transaction often understands exactly how desperate the buyer has become. I cannot remain silent when an unemployed mother is told to give away the final money in her pocket. I cannot accept a system in which she must choose between buying bread for her children and purchasing a promise from a wealthy preacher. I cannot accept a system in which the poor are required to prove their faith through sacrifice, while the rich prove their holiness through luxury. The mother arrives at the church carrying pain. She has no job. Her electricity has been disconnected. Her child needs medicine. She has borrowed money from relatives who are also struggling. She has prayed privately. She has waited. She has cried. Then a man stands before her and says that her breakthrough is close. He tells her that God has seen her suffering. He tells her that an enemy has blocked her future. He tells her that a curse is responsible for her hardship. Then he says she must sow a special seed. Not tomorrow. Not when she is able. Now, he creates urgency because urgency weakens judgment. He creates fear because fear makes people obedient. He promises certainty because desperate people are tired of uncertainty. The mother takes out her final money. She gives it to a man who may already own several houses, several cars, and more wealth than her entire street. She returns home without food. The preacher returns home with another offering. Then, when nothing changes, the blame is placed on her. She did not believe enough. She doubted. She spoke negatively. She did not give enough. She had hidden sin. The promise is never questioned. The person who sold the promise is never held responsible. The failure is transferred back to the victim. That is how the system protects itself. If the miracle happens, the preacher takes the credit. If it does not happen, the believer takes the blame. This is not spiritual care. It is emotional manipulation. It is the exploitation of desperation. The business takes many forms. In one city, people are told to buy anointed oil. In another, they are sold holy water. Some are offered prayer clothes. Some are given special bracelets. Some are told to purchase access to private prophecy. Some are asked to pay for a place in a healing line. Some are told that a more expensive offering will unlock a greater blessing. The products may change. The principle remains the same. Pain is converted into income. Fear is converted into loyalty. Hope is converted into a commercial product. You can see versions of this system in Johannesburg. You can see it in Pretoria. You can see it in Lagos. You can see it in Accra. You can see it in Nairobi. You can see it in Kinshasa. You can see it in Harare. This is not the problem of one nation. It is not the problem of one denomination. It is a pattern that crosses borders because desperation also crosses borders. Where unemployment is high, false promises find an audience. Where healthcare is weak, fake healing finds customers. Where education is limited, superstition becomes easier to weaponize. Where government is corrupt, people search for supernatural solutions to political failures. And where communities are afraid to question religious authority, abuse grows in silence. Some leaders display wealth as proof of divine favor. They stand beside expensive vehicles. They travel in private aircraft. They wear clothing that costs more than a worker earns in months. They live behind high walls while their followers live in informal settlements. Then they point to their luxury and say that this is what faith can produce. But whose faith produced that wealth? Was it the leader's faith? Or was it the sacrifice of thousands of poor people? A church leader may say that prosperity is evidence of blessing. But we must ask, who paid for the prosperity? We must ask whether the people giving the money have food. We must ask whether the organization has transparent accounts. We must ask whether donations are being used for community work or personal luxury. We must ask whether the leader's family controls the church as private property. We must ask whether anyone is allowed to question financial decisions. A sacred title must never become protection from accountability. Calling yourself a prophet does not place you above the law. Calling yourself an apostle does not give you ownership over another person's mind. Claiming spiritual authority does not remove your responsibility to explain where the money goes. No leader should be afraid of transparency if the money is being used honestly. The refusal to answer simple questions often reveals the true structure of power. Who owns the buildings? Who owns the vehicles? Who controls the bank accounts? Who decides the salary? Who appoints the board? Who can remove the leader? What happens to anyone who asks these questions? In a healthy religious community, questions should not be treated as rebellion. They should be treated as protection. Transparency protects believers. It protects honest leaders. It protects the reputation of the institution. It prevents money meant for the community from becoming the private wealth of one person. But those who depend on secrecy will always describe accountability as persecution. They will say that critics are attacking the church. They will say that questions come from the devil. They will say that the leader must not be touched because he is anointed. This language is dangerous. It creates a human being who cannot be challenged. Once a leader becomes untouchable, abuse becomes almost inevitable. The leader can control money. He can control relationships. He can control voting choices. He can control medical decisions. He can control who people marry. He can even control how families understand illness, death, and misfortune. That is no longer spiritual guidance. It is domination. The most dangerous cases involve health. A sick person is told not to go to a hospital. A patient is told to stop taking medicine. A parent is told that a child's condition is caused by demons. A person with depression is told that prayer alone must replace professional care. A family facing a serious disease is promised a cure in exchange for money. Faith can give courage during illness. Prayer can give comfort. Community can give strength. But none of these should be used to block medical treatment. A leader who tells a person to abandon necessary care accepts a responsibility he may not understand and has no right to carry. And when the patient becomes worse, the same pattern appears. The patient is blamed. The family is blamed. The faith was not strong enough. The offering was not large enough. The confession was not complete enough. Again, the leader escapes responsibility. The victim carries the shame. This must stop. There is another form of manipulation that uses fear of evil spirits. A family is told that its problems come from a relative. A child is accused of bringing misfortune. An elderly woman is called a witch. A marriage is destroyed because a self-proclaimed prophet says one partner is possessed. A person is separated from friends and relatives because the leader says those people are blocking the blessing. Isolation makes control easier. Once a believer trusts only the leader becomes the center of reality. Every problem requires his interpretation. Every decision requires his permission. Every solution requires another payment. This is how a community of faith becomes a personality cult. The name of God remains on the building, but the power belongs to one man. The songs may still be sung. The Bible may still be open. The congregation may still say amen, but the institution no longer directs people toward truth. It directs them toward dependence on a human being. No one should have to pay money to be heard by God. No one should have to purchase access to prayer. No one should be told that poverty proves a lack of faith. No one should be told that wealth proves moral superiority. There are dishonest people in every institution. Politics has them. Business has them. Government has them. Religious organizations have them. The difference is that religious exploitation often reaches deeper because it touches the most private fears of the human heart. A corrupt politician may threaten your income. A false prophet may threaten your soul. He may tell you that questioning him will bring a curse. He may tell you that leaving the church will destroy your family. He may tell you that God speaks only through him. That is why religious abuse can continue even when the evidence is visible. People are not only afraid of losing the community, they are afraid of losing divine protection. We must separate God from the person exploiting God's name. A leader is not God. A building is not God. A title is not God. An expensive suit is not God. A television audience is not God. A large congregation is not proof of truth. Popularity is not holiness. Wealth is not righteousness. And fear is not faith. True spiritual leadership should make people stronger. It should not make them dependent. It should help them think. It should not punish questions. It should care for their pain. It should not turn their pain into a business opportunity. It should encourage responsibility. It should not promise that every social and economic problem will disappear through a payment at the altar. A sincere church should be able to tell an unemployed person that prayer matters, while also helping that person develop skills, find opportunities, and understand the economy. It should be able to pray for a sick person while encouraging medical treatment. It should be able to speak about generosity without placing pressure on those who cannot afford to give. It should be able to support a leader without turning him into an idol. It should be able to admit when it does not have an answer. Humility is not weakness. It is a sign that a leader understands the limits of human authority. I know that many believers may feel uncomfortable hearing these words. Some may say that criticism gives enemies an opportunity to attack the church. But silence gives abusers an opportunity to destroy the church from within. When honest believers refuse to confront exploitation, they leave the meaning of religion in the hands of the exploiters. They allow the public to see only the scandals. They allow the poor to carry wounds caused by people who claim to represent God. Protecting faith does not mean protecting every person who uses religious language. Sometimes faith is protected by exposing those who misuse it. Sometimes the strongest defense of the church is accountability. Sometimes the most honest prayer begins with admitting that something is wrong. The poor do not need another person to blame them for being poor. They do not need to be told that every hardship comes from a curse. They do not need to be promised instant wealth. They need truth. They need education. They need jobs. They need fair wages. They need health care. They need safety. They need government institutions that function. They need communities that do not abandon them. And yes, many also need faith, but they need a faith that walks beside them. Not a faith that empties their pockets. Not a faith that replaces every practical solution with a paid promise. Not a faith that tells them to celebrate the wealth of the leader while their own children remain hungry. The miracle business survives because African suffering is real. It survives because people are looking for answers. It survives because governments have failed. It survives because inequality creates desperation. It survives because many people have nowhere else to turn. That means we cannot defeat exploitation only by criticizing false prophets. We must also remove the conditions that make false promises so powerful. We must build hospitals people can trust. We must build schools that educate. We must create jobs that give dignity. We must support mental health care. We must protect people from violence. We must create social systems that do not force the poor to search for miracles simply to survive another week. But even as we repair those systems, religious institutions must accept responsibility. They must separate service from spectacle. They must separate leadership from celebrity. They must separate community donations from personal wealth. They must stop presenting luxury as proof that God favors one person over another. The true measure of a religious community is not the size of its stage. It is the condition of the people standing beyond the stage. Are the hungry being fed? Are children being protected? Are women safe? Are the sick receiving proper care? Are young people being educated? Are the grieving being supported? Are the finance transparent? Can the leader be questioned? Can wrongdoing be reported without fear? These questions matter more than the number of followers on social media. They matter more than the size of the building. They matter more than the volume of the music. They matter more than the title placed before a leader's name. When a church becomes a business, the congregation becomes a market. When a preacher becomes a celebrity, believers become an audience. When miracles become products, desperation becomes currency. And when spiritual authorities combine with political ambition, something even more dangerous begins to form. The politician sees a large congregation. The religious leader sees access to power. One wants votes. The other wants protection, recognition, or influence. They meet before the cameras. They pray. They smile. They exchange praise. And the line between faith and political control begins to disappear. That is where our next question must begin. What happens when the pulpit enters into an alliance with the seat of power? There is a moment in every election season when politicians suddenly rediscover religion. They begin appearing in churches. They sit in the front row. They wear their best clothes. They raise their hands during prayer. They speak about humility. They quote scripture. They ask religious leaders to place hands upon them before the cameras. And for a few hours, the same people who ignored the suffering of communities begin to speak as if they have been sent by God. I have watched this pattern many times. A politician who has not visited a poor neighborhood for years suddenly arrives at a church near election day. He greets the pastor. He praises the congregation. He gives a donation in public. He speaks about values. He speaks about unity. He asks the people to pray for the nation, but he does not explain where the missing money went. He does not explain why the local clinic has no medicine. He does not explain why the school has broken toilets. He does not explain why young people remain unemployed. He does not explain why contracts went to friends, relatives, and political allies. The cameras record the prayer. They do not always record the unanswered questions. That is how religion can be used to clean the image of power. A prayer becomes a public relations event. A church service becomes a campaign rally. A religious leader becomes a political shield. And the congregation is expected to confuse spiritual blessing with political approval. Let me say this clearly. A politician can be prayed for. A president can be prayed for. A minister can be prayed for. A member of parliament can be prayed for. But prayer does not remove accountability. No blessing should erase a record of corruption. No religious ceremony should cancel the responsibility to explain public decisions. No pastor, priest, prophet, or bishop has the authority to declare a politician innocent on behalf of the people. The people have the right to ask questions. They have the right to inspect the record. They have the right to reject a leader. And they have the right to vote according to their conscience. The vote is a civic right. It is not property belonging to a church leader. It is not a gift that a congregation must hand to a political party. It is not an offering placed at the feet of a preacher. A religious leader may teach about justice. A church may speak about corruption. A mosque may speak about poverty. A community of faith may defend human dignity. But the moment a spiritual leader tells believers that they must vote for one politician because God has chosen that person, danger enters the room. Who gave that leader access to God's private political list? Who allowed him to speak as if heaven had registered a political party? Who decided that disagreement with a candidate was disagreement with God? This language is designed to frighten people. It does not persuade them through policy. It pressures them through faith. It tells the believer that voting differently may be an act of spiritual rebellion. It removes political choice and replaces it with religious fear. That is not democracy. That is manipulation. In Pretoria, Johannesburg, Cape Town, and communities across South Africa, political leaders understand the influence of religious institutions. They know that one respected church leader may speak to thousands of people. They know that a photograph inside a church can create an image of morality. They know that public prayer can make a leader appear humble even when his conduct outside the church shows arrogance. They know that faith can soften the way people judge power. This is why the pulpit becomes valuable during an election. The politician wants legitimacy. The religious leader may want access. The politician wants votes. The religious leader may want influence, protection, donations, land, licenses, or recognition. The politician offers visibility. The religious leader offers moral approval. And the people are expected to believe that the relationship is only spiritual. Sometimes it may be sincere, but sometimes it is an exchange. That exchange must be examined. A politician who gives money to a church in public should be willing to explain where the money came from. A religious organization that receives political donations should be willing to disclose them. A pastor who endorses a candidate should be willing to explain whether there is any financial or personal relationship behind that endorsement. A church leader who speaks about national morality should also accept moral scrutiny. Transparency cannot be demanded from government while being rejected inside religious institutions. Power must be questioned wherever it appears. That includes parliament. That includes political parties. That includes businesses, and it includes the church. Mmusi Maimane comes into this discussion from a different place than I do. He has a Christian ministerial background. He has spoken about leadership, ethics, citizenship, education, and the moral condition of government. I may disagree with him on economic structure. I may disagree with him on the scale of state intervention. I may disagree with him on how ownership, land, and resources should be reorganized. But one point remains important. A politician who speaks about faith must accept greater scrutiny, not less. He must never use religion as protection from criticism. He must show that his public actions reflect the values he claims. The same standard applies to me. It applies to every leader. No one should be allowed to speak about the poor inside a church and then support policies that keep the poor powerless. No one should speak about honesty on Sunday and protect corruption on Monday. No one should speak about justice before a congregation and remain silent when public money is stolen. No one should speak about family values while government decisions destroy the security of families. Religion must not become a language politicians use only when cameras are present. Faith, when it is sincere, should place a burden on power. It should make leaders more accountable. It should remind them that public office is not private property. It should force them to ask whether their decisions protect the vulnerable. It should make them uncomfortable when people suffer. But when religion is controlled by political interests, the opposite happens. Instead of challenging power, it praises power. Instead of asking difficult questions, it offers convenient blessings. Instead of defending the poor, it provides a front row seat to those who failed them. The church becomes quiet before the powerful and loud before the powerless. It tells the unemployed to work harder. It tells the poor to give more. It tells women to endure. It tells young people to be patient. But when a minister misuses public funds, the same church suddenly loses its voice. That silence is political. A religious institution may claim neutrality, but silence in the presence of injustice benefits those already in control. When workers are exploited, silence protects the employer. When women are abused, silence protects the abuser. When public money is stolen, silence protects the thief. When political leaders fail, silence protects the government. Neutrality often becomes another name for choosing the stronger side. This does not mean every religious leader must join a political party. It does not mean every sermon must become a policy speech. It does not mean churches must abandon worship and become campaign organizations. It means moral leadership cannot avoid reality. A church that speaks about truth must speak when the government lies. A church that speaks about theft must speak when public resources are stolen. A church that speaks about compassion must speak when budgets abandon the poor. A church that speaks about human life must speak when communities are killed, neglected, or denied basic services. Otherwise, religion becomes selective. It becomes strict about private behavior but weak about public injustice. It becomes brave when judging individuals and silent when confronting systems. I do not care which church pew a president occupies. I care how many people have work when he leaves the church. I do not care how many Bible verses a minister can recite. I care how many public contracts he has signed honestly. I care whether money meant for housing reached the people. I care whether schools received books. I care whether hospitals received medicine. I care whether the young received opportunity. I care whether the government protected those who could not protect themselves. A politician must be judged by public conduct, not by the size of the prayer offered for him, not by the number of pastors standing beside him, not by the religious titles of his supporters, not by the number of times he mentions God during a campaign. A corrupt leader can learn religious language. A dishonest leader can attend church. A failed leader can quote scripture. A thief can sit in the front row. Religion alone does not prove character. Character is revealed through decisions. It is revealed through what a leader does when no cameras are present. It is revealed by whether he tells the truth when the truth is costly. It is revealed by whether he returns stolen money. It is revealed by whether he accepts responsibility. It is revealed by whether he protects the people instead of protecting his position. There is another danger in the alliance between religion and political power. Once a politician is described as chosen by God, criticism becomes dangerous. Supporters begin to treat political questions as spiritual attacks. They say the leader must not be touched. They say opposition is inspired by evil. They say anyone who challenges him is fighting against divine authority. This destroys democracy. Democracy depends on the right to question. It depends on the right to disagree. It depends on the right to remove leaders peacefully. It depends on the principle that no individual is greater than the Constitution, the law, or the people. But when a leader is given sacred status, normal accountability becomes impossible. Every failure receives an excuse. Every scandal becomes persecution. Every investigation becomes an attack on faith. Every critic becomes an enemy. That is how political loyalty becomes a form of worship. And political leaders should never be worshipped. They are public servants. They make mistakes. They can become corrupt. They can lie. They can fail. They must therefore be watched, questioned, and replaced when necessary. The language of divine selection is also used to protect incompetence. A politician may say that God placed him in office, but God did not write the budget. God did not approve the tender. God did not choose the contractor. God did not hide the financial records. Human beings made those decisions. Human beings must answer for them. We cannot place every success on the leader and every failure on mysterious forces. Government is a human responsibility. It requires planning. It requires skill. It requires transparent administration. It requires consequences when people fail. Prayer cannot replace competence. Faith cannot replace policy. A blessing cannot replace a functioning institution. This is why I become concerned when political leaders spend more time seeking religious endorsement than explaining their plans. A candidate should tell the people how jobs will be created. He should explain how crime will be reduced. He should explain how schools will improve. He should explain how land will be distributed. He should explain how public money will be protected. He should explain who will own the resources of the country. He should explain how communities will benefit from economic growth. That is the conversation democracy requires. But religious theater can distract from these questions. The politician is photographed while praying. The image spreads. People describe him as humble. No one asks whether the policy is credible. No one asks whether the numbers are honest. No one asks whether the promises can be delivered. Image replaces substance. Emotion replaces examination. The pulpit becomes a stage where political identity is purified. This is not only a South African problem. Across Africa, political leaders use religious gatherings to demonstrate legitimacy. Some build relationships with Christian leaders. Others seek support from Muslim leaders. Others use traditional authority. The details differ. The purpose is often the same. Power seeks a sacred language because sacred language can make political authority appear unquestionable. But no religion should belong to a political party. No church should become the private territory of a government. No religious leader should control the conscience of a voter. And no politician should use God as the spokesperson for an election campaign. The responsibility of a religious leader is not to deliver votes. It is to defend truth. The responsibility of a politician is not to collect blessings. It is to serve the public. When these roles become confused, both institutions are damaged. Politics becomes dishonest. Religion loses moral credibility. The people become instruments in an agreement they were never allowed to examine. I believe churches should ask political candidates difficult questions. They should ask about unemployment. They should ask about land. They should ask about corruption. They should ask about violence against women. They should ask about healthcare. They should ask about education. They should ask about inequality. They should ask about the treatment of migrants. They should ask about workers. They should ask about the condition of prisons. They should ask about the use of public money. But they should ask these questions of every party. They should not demand answers from one leader while protecting another. Justice must not change according to political friendship. A church that criticizes corruption under one government must criticize it under every government. A pastor who challenges one party must be willing to challenge the party he personally supports. Moral authority depends on consistency. Without consistency, religion becomes another political weapon. There must also be transparency inside religious organizations. If a church receives money from politicians, the congregation should know. If a political party pays for transport to a religious gathering, the public should know. If a leader receives personal gifts, the community should know. If a church platform is used for campaigning, the arrangement should be disclosed. Secret relationships create secret obligations. And secret obligations weaken public trust. Some people will say that these questions interfere with religious freedom. I disagree. Religious freedom does not mean freedom from accountability. A church has the right to worship. It has the right to preach. It has the right to organize. It has the right to speak about society. But when it becomes involved in political influence, public money, election activity, or financial relationships with leaders, the public has the right to ask questions. Freedom and accountability must live together. Without freedom, institutions become controlled by the state. Without accountability, institutions can become tools of private power. The goal is not to silence religion. The goal is to prevent religion from being captured. The goal is not to stop believers from participating in politics. Believers are citizens. They have the right to lead. They have the right to campaign. They have the right to vote, but they must participate as citizens who can be questioned, not as sacred figures who cannot be challenged. Their faith may guide their conscience. It must not become a weapon used to control the conscience of others. I want a society in which a Christian can vote freely, a Muslim can vote freely. A person who follows African traditional beliefs can vote freely. A person with no religion can vote freely. No one should be threatened with spiritual punishment because of a political choice. No one should be told that a ballot belongs to a pastor. No one should be told that a party owns a church. The ballot belongs to the citizen. The conscience belongs to the individual. The future belongs to the people. When election day arrives, the voter enters the booth alone. The pastor is not inside. The president is not inside. The party is not inside. The camera is not inside. That private moment is one of the few places where an ordinary citizen stands equal to the most powerful person in the country. The vote of the worker counts. The vote of the billionaire counts. The vote of the pastor counts. The vote of the unemployed mother counts. That equality must be protected. Once religious authority controls the ballot, democracy becomes weaker. Once political power controls the pulpit, faith becomes weaker. The two institutions may speak to each other. They may challenge each other. They may cooperate in serving communities, but they must never protect each other from accountability. The church must remain free to question the state. The state must remain unable to purchase religious silence. The politician must remain answerable to the people. The religious leader must remain answerable to the truth. There is one final question we must ask. Why do powerful politicians seek blessings so publicly? Sometimes it is because they sincerely believe. But sometimes it is because religion can make power appear moral. That appearance becomes especially useful when economic injustice continues. A leader may pray with the poor while protecting the interests of the wealthy. He may speak about sacrifice while signing agreements that move national wealth into private hands. He may ask the people to trust God while foreign companies continue to control resources beneath African soil. The prayer becomes a curtain. Behind that curtain, ownership remains unchanged. The faces in government may be African. The flags may be African. The national anthem may be African, but the prophets continue to leave the continent. That is why the conversation cannot end with the relationship between pastors and politicians. We must also examine the forces that stand behind them. We must ask who owns the mines. We must ask who controls the banks. We must ask who benefits from the contracts. We must ask why nations that preach morality to Africa continue to profit from unequal economic relationships. Because the pulpit and the political seat are not the only centers of power. Beyond them stands another system. A system that speaks about charity while controlling resources. A system that speaks about human rights while protecting economic privilege. A system that offers aid with one hand while wealth leaves Africa through the other. That is where our next struggle begins. There is a sentence I've repeated because Africa must understand it clearly. Africa is not poor. Africa has been made poor. Beneath our soil, there is gold. There are diamonds. There is platinum. There is cobalt. There is copper. There is oil. There is land capable of producing food. There are rivers capable of producing energy. There are young people capable of building industries, technologies, institutions, and nations. Yet above this wealth, millions of Africans still live without decent housing, reliable electricity, clean water, proper schools, and secure employment. That contradiction is not natural. It is not an accident, and it cannot be explained by saying Africans do not pray enough. We must ask who owns the wealth. We must ask who extracts it. We must ask who processes it. We must ask where the profits go. We must ask why African countries export raw materials, then buy finished products at prices they do not control. We must ask why communities living beside some of the richest mines in the world remain among the poorest communities in their countries. Around Johannesburg, gold helped build enormous fortunes. In the platinum belt around Rustenburg, workers have spent their lives extracting a mineral desired across the world. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, cobalt has become essential to modern technology. In Nigeria, oil has generated vast wealth. Yet the ordinary people living near these resources often receive pollution, dangerous working conditions, broken roads, and poverty. The wealth moves outward. The suffering remains behind. Then some of the same powerful countries and institutions that benefit from these arrangements return to Africa with advice. They lecture us about governance. They lecture us about discipline. They lecture us about human rights. They lecture us about corruption. Some of those criticisms may be justified. African leaders must never use colonial history as an excuse for present corruption. A government that steals from its people is guilty. A minister who misuses public funds is guilty. A business leader who exploits workers is guilty. We must take responsibility for the failures that belong to us. But responsibility must not be selective. Those who speak about African corruption must also speak about the banks that receive stolen money. They must speak about the companies that pay bribes. They must speak about the lawyers, accountants, consultants, and financial systems that help wealth disappear. They must speak about contracts written in ways that allow enormous value to leave Africa. They must speak about tax structures that make multinational corporations rich while African governments remain unable to fund essential services. It is easy to condemn the corrupt official who signs the agreement. It is less common to condemn the international company that benefits from it. Both sides must be held accountable. There is a moral contradiction when a government speaks about freedom while protecting an economic system built on unequal ownership. There is a contradiction when a nation speaks about human rights but ignores the history of companies that benefited from colonialism or apartheid. There is a contradiction when organizations speak about ending poverty while refusing to discuss who controls land, technology, finance, and natural resources. Charity can relieve suffering, but charity does not automatically change the system that creates suffering. A food parcel may help a family survive today, but it does not answer why that family has no land. A donation may place books in a school, but it does not answer why the country exports billions in natural wealth while schools remain underfunded. A foreign aid program may build a clinic, but it does not answer why profits from African minerals finance development somewhere else. This is why pity is not enough. Africa does not only need compassion, Africa needs ownership. Africa needs technology. Africa needs the ability to process its own resources. Africa needs industries that create jobs at home. Africa needs banks that serve development instead of only serving established wealth. Africa needs energy systems that support production. Africa needs trade relationships in which Africans negotiate as equals. Africa needs economic sovereignty. When I say this, some people accuse me of hostility toward the West. That is not the point. Every person in the West is not an enemy of Africa. Every church, charity, organization, or business from outside Africa is not part of a conspiracy. Many people have worked honestly beside African communities. Many have opposed racism. Many have challenged exploitation. Many have sacrificed their own comfort to defend justice. The issue is not the skin color or nationality of every individual. The issue is the structure of power. The issue is an economic order in which Africa supplies the raw materials, carries the environmental damage, provides cheap labor, and receives only a small part of the final value. The issue is a relationship in which others control the technology, financing, shipping, processing, branding, and global markets. The issue is that political independence did not always create economic independence. A flag can change while ownership remains the same. A parliament can be filled with African representatives while major economic decisions continue to be shaped elsewhere. A president can make speeches about sovereignty while the country remains dependent on foreign capital, foreign technology, foreign loans, and foreign markets. That is why we must look beyond appearances. The question is not only who occupies the office. The question is who controls the economy that limits the choices of the person in that office. Some countries offer loans with conditions that shape national policy. Some corporations become more powerful than the communities and governments dealing with them. Some trade agreements preserve Africa's role as a supplier of raw materials. Some development programs treat Africans as permanent recipients rather than future owners and producers. Then moral language is used to make this relationship appear generous. The powerful say they are helping Africa. They do not always explain how much value they are taking from Africa. They show the small amount that returns as aid. They do not show the much larger amount that leaves through profit, debt payments, unfair contracts, illegal financial flows, and the export of unprocessed resources. They ask Africans to be grateful, but gratitude must never replace analysis. We should appreciate honest assistance. We should cooperate with nations willing to treat us fairly. We should learn from scientific, educational, and technological achievements wherever they are found, but cooperation must not require submission. Friendship must not require dependency. Aid must not purchase silence. And moral lectures must not hide economic exploitation. There is also a religious dimension to this relationship. Some organizations arrive speaking about salvation while avoiding questions about economic justice. They pray for poor African communities. They distribute food. They build churches. But they do not challenge the corporations or international policies that contribute to poverty. They teach personal morality while remaining silent about structural injustice. They tell the individual to change his behavior. They do not tell the economic system to change its behavior. They tell the poor to become more disciplined. They do not ask why those controlling the wealth are not required to become more just. That is an incomplete morality. A faith concerned about theft must also speak about the theft of land. A faith concerned about greed must also speak about corporate greed. A faith concerned about honesty must examine dishonest contracts. A faith concerned about human dignity must challenge working conditions that destroy human dignity. A faith concerned about life must care about pollution, unsafe mines, hunger, and preventable disease. It is not enough to pray for the poor. We must confront what makes them poor. It is not enough to pray for minors. We must ask what they earn, where they live, and whether they are safe. It is not enough to pray for children. We must ask why their schools lack water, books, teachers, and toilets. It is not enough to pray for Africa. We must ask who owns Africa's future. When I look at the mines around Johannesburg, I do not see only rocks and machines. I see generations of labor. I see men who entered the ground before sunrise and returned with bodies damaged by the work. I see families separated because workers had to travel far from home. I see communities created around an economy that needed African labor but did not always respect African life. When I look at the platinum belt near Rustenburg, I remember that minerals can become more valuable than the people who extract them. When I think about Congo, I see a country filled with resources that the modern world needs. But I also see the long history of outside powers competing for control. When I think about oil in Nigeria, I see wealth powerful enough to transform millions of lives. But I also see communities facing pollution, conflict, and exclusion. The same pattern appears again and again. Africa produces what the world wants. The world takes what Africa produces. African elites receive a share. Ordinary Africans are told to wait. Then religion is sometimes used to keep that waiting peaceful. The poor are told that envy is sinful. Workers are told that demanding more is greed. Communities are told to be grateful for small donations. People are told that their reward will come later. But those benefiting from the present system are not asked to wait. Their profits arrive now. Their dividends arrive now. Their homes, cars, and security arrive now. Only the poor are asked to postpone justice. That is why we must reject a morality that demands sacrifice only from those who have already sacrificed the most. Justice cannot mean that a worker must be humble while a corporation remains greedy. Justice cannot mean that a community must forgive while no one returns what was taken. Justice cannot mean that Africa must remain dependent so that others can remain powerful. We need a new relationship with the world. Not isolation, not hatred, not revenge. Equality. We must negotiate from the knowledge that our resources have value. We must invest in processing and manufacturing. We must educate engineers, scientists, teachers, doctors, builders, and skilled workers. We must strengthen cooperation among African nations. We must trade more with one another. We must protect public institutions from corruption. We must refuse agreements that benefit a few political leaders while weakening entire countries. We must build an Africa that does not export every opportunity with every shipment of raw material. When cobalt leaves Africa without being processed, jobs leave with it. When gold leaves Africa without strengthening local industry, opportunity leaves with it. When oil leaves while communities remain without energy, justice leaves with it. When profits leave while workers remain poor, dignity lives with them. Economic sovereignty does not mean closing the borders and refusing the world. It means entering the world with strength. It means controlling enough of our own wealth to make independent choices. It means that foreign investment must benefit African workers and communities. It means technology must be shared and developed. It means contracts must be transparent. It means the environment must be protected. It means future generations must inherit more than empty mines and polluted land. Africa should not be a warehouse from which the world collects raw materials. Africa should be a producer. Africa should be an innovator. Africa should own companies, technologies, factories, infrastructure, and intellectual property. Africa should not always stand at the end of the table asking for assistance. Africa must help build the table. But we cannot achieve this while our own leaders remain corrupt. We cannot blame outsiders for everything while African officials sign harmful contracts. We cannot speak about sovereignty while stealing public money. We cannot demand justice from international institutions while denying justice to our own citizens. The struggle is against exploitation from outside and betrayal from within. Both must be confronted. The foreign corporation that abuses Africa must be challenged. The African politician who helps it must also be challenged. The international bank that hides stolen wealth must be challenged. The official who steals the wealth must also be challenged. The system survives because powerful interests cooperate across borders. Our resistance must therefore be equally serious. It must be informed. It must be organized. It must be economically intelligent. And it must refuse to be distracted by religious language that tells us structural injustice is only a spiritual problem. A nation cannot pray its way out of a contract designed to exploit it. A worker cannot fast his way into a fair wage if the law and the employer protect exploitation. A community cannot defeat pollution through worship alone. Prayer may give people courage. Faith may help them endure the struggle. But courage must lead to action. Faith must lead to justice. Hope must lead to organization. The West must not preach morality to Africa while refusing to examine the economic structures from which it benefits. And Africa must not use anger toward the West to avoid confronting its own failures. We must tell the whole truth. The whole truth is that Africa has been exploited. The whole truth is also that some African leaders have helped the exploitation continue. The whole truth is that religion has sometimes resisted this injustice. The whole truth is also that religion has sometimes been used to make the injustice easier to accept. This brings us back to the ordinary person, the worker, the mother, the unemployed young person, the woman trapped in an abusive home, the migrant searching for safety, the family living in an informal settlement. They are the people who carry the cost of these systems. And when they demand change, they are often told to remain patient. They are told to obey. They are told to suffer quietly. They are told that a reward is waiting in heaven. That is the next form of control we must confront. Because patience can be a virtue. But when patience is used to protect injustice, it becomes a chain. There are words that can give people strength. Patience is one of them. Sacrifice is another. Humility can protect a person from arrogance. Forgiveness can free a heart from hatred. Faith can help people survive moments that appear impossible. But every good word can be misused. Patience can become a command to remain silent. Sacrifice can become an excuse for exploitation. Humility can become a demand that the poor never challenge the rich. Forgiveness can be demanded before truth has been spoken. Faith can be turned into a reason to accept injustice without resistance. That is when spiritual language becomes dangerous. I have heard workers being told that demanding a living wage is a sign of greed. I have heard unemployed people being told that they must simply pray harder. I have heard women living with violence being told to return home and endure for the sake of the family. I have heard communities demanding clean water being described as impatient. I have heard young people without jobs being blamed for lacking discipline, even when the economy has failed to create opportunities for them. These messages always place the burden on the person who is already suffering. The system is never asked to change. The employer is not told to pay fairly. The government is not told to deliver services. The abuser is not told to stop. The corrupt official is not told to return the money. Instead, the victim is told to become more patient. That is not justice. It is a method of protecting power. When a mine worker asks for enough money to feed his family, do not tell him that the love of money is the root of evil. Ask whether the person paying him has more than enough. Ask whether the company is making profit from his labor. Ask whether the wage reflects the danger of the work. Ask whether he has safe housing. Ask whether his family has health care. Ask whether the wealth taken from beneath African soil is improving the lives of the people who extract it. A worker asking to live with dignity is not worshipping money. He is asking to survive. He is asking to raise his children. He is asking for the value of his labor to be recognized. He is asking for a share of the wealth he helps create. That is not greed. The greed may exist elsewhere. It may exist in the boardroom. It may exist in the contract. It may exist in the person receiving millions while telling the worker to be content with almost nothing. We must be careful about who receives the sermon on sacrifice. It is easy for a wealthy person to praise sacrifice when someone else is making it. It is easy for a comfortable leader to preach endurance from a protected stage. It is easy to speak about patience when your own children have food, security, and opportunity. But patience sounds different in a home without electricity. It sounds different in a clinic without medicine. It sounds different in a settlement without clean water. It sounds different when a mother must decide which child will eat enough that night. The poor know patience. They have practiced it for generations. They wait for housing. They wait for jobs. They wait for land. They wait for schools to improve. They wait for police to respond. They wait for the government to repair roads. They wait for promises made during election campaigns. They wait while others grow rich from the same system that keeps them poor. The question is not whether the poor can be patient. The question is how long injustice expects them to wait. In Marikana, on the 16th of August, 2012, 34 mine workers were shot and killed by police. They had been demanding better wages. They were workers in one of the richest mining regions of the country. They were not standing beside empty ground. They were standing near enormous mineral wealth. Yet many of them lived under conditions that did not reflect the value they produced. Their deaths remain a wound in South Africa. Marikana forces us to ask what happens when economic demands are treated as a threat. It forces us to ask why workers asking for dignity can be met with violence. It forces us to ask whether the state protects human life equally. It also forces religious communities to examine their own response. When workers ask for justice, does the church stand beside them, or does it tell them to return to work and obey? When the police use deadly force, does the church demand truth, or does it speak only about peace without asking who created the conflict? Peace without justice is often only silence imposed upon the wounded. True peace requires truth. It requires accountability. It requires the conditions that cause the conflict to be changed. A sermon cannot bury injustice. A prayer cannot replace an investigation. A memorial cannot replace responsibility. The dead deserve more than respectful words. They deserve a society that learns from what happened. They deserve an economy that does not treat workers as disposable. They deserve a government that values human life above political convenience. They deserve religious institutions willing to stand against power when power becomes violent. The same question applies to women trapped in abusive homes. There are women who enter churches looking for safety. They carry bruises beneath their clothing. They carry fear that no one else can see. They have been threatened. They have been isolated. They have been told that no one will believe them. Then they approach a religious leader and ask for help. Too often, they are told to return home. They are told to forgive. They are told to submit. They are told that divorce is shameful. They are told that prayer will change the man. They are told that speaking publicly will damage the reputation of the family or the church. This is not spiritual guidance. It is abandonment. No woman should be sent back into danger because an institution is more concerned about appearance than her life. No scripture should be used to protect an abuser. No religious title should prevent a case from being reported to the authorities. No family should be told to hide violence in order to avoid embarrassment. Forgiveness does not require a victim to remain within reach of the person harming her. Faith does not require silence. Marriage does not remove the right to safety. And preserving the reputation of an institution is never more important than protecting a human life. The same applies to children. When a child reports abuse, the first responsibility is protection, not secrecy, not damage control, not private negotiation, not an internal meeting designed to protect a leader. The matter must be handled by people trained to investigate. The law must be allowed to work. The child must be believed, supported, and protected from further harm. Too many institutions have placed their reputation above the safety of the vulnerable. They fear scandal more than they fear injustice. But secrecy does not protect faith. It protects the offender. An institution that hides abuse destroys its own moral authority. It tells the victim that the organization matters more than the truth. That must never be accepted. There are also domestic workers who are expected to endure humiliation quietly. They enter the homes of wealthy families before sunrise. They clean, they cook, they care for children, they care for the elderly. They often leave their own families behind in order to serve another family. Yet, many are underpaid. Some are insulted. Some are treated as if they are invisible. Some are expected to be grateful simply because they have work. Then they attend religious services where they hear about obedience, service, and humility. Those teachings may have value, but they become cruel when only the worker is expected to obey. What about the employer's duty? What about fair pay? What about respect? What about rest? What about safe working conditions? What about the dignity of the person performing the labor? A religion that teaches service must also teach responsibility to those being served. A religion that teaches workers to be honest must teach employers not to exploit. A religion that tells the poor not to steal must tell the rich not to withhold fair wages. Morality cannot apply only downward. It must also speak upward. It must confront those with money, authority, and influence. Otherwise, morality becomes another tool used to discipline the weak. In places such as Alexandra, Kaelicha, Seshego, and working communities around Rustenburg, people live close to the visible wealth of the country. They see offices, shopping centers, stadiums, mines, and expensive neighborhoods. They know that money exists. They know that resources exist. They know that opportunity exists. But they also know that access is unequal. A child growing up in an informal settlement does not begin life with the same conditions as a child growing up behind secure walls. One may have private education, reliable transport, internet access, healthcare, and personal connections. The other may study in an overcrowded classroom. The other may walk long distances. The other may live where electricity is unreliable. The other may not know where the next meal will come from. Then society tells both children that success depends only on hard work. Hard work matters. Discipline matters. Personal responsibility matters. But conditions also matter. A race cannot be called equal when some participants begin far behind the others. To recognize structural injustice is not to deny individual responsibility. It is to tell the truth about the road people are expected to travel. A young person may work hard and still find no job. A student may study and still attend a school without enough teachers. A mother may budget carefully and still earn too little to cover basic expenses. A worker may avoid every unnecessary cost and still remain poor because the wage is insufficient. Poverty is not always a failure of character. It is often the result of political decisions. It may result from unequal ownership. It may result from weak public services. It may result from corruption. It may result from unemployment. It may result from racial and historical inequality. It may result from policies that protect profit while wages remain low. When these problems are reduced to personal morality, the institutions responsible are allowed to escape. The unemployed person becomes guilty. The poor family becomes guilty. The struggling student becomes guilty. The government disappears from the story. The economy disappears from the story. History disappears from the story, only the suffering individual remains. That is why we must reject the spiritualization of every economic problem. A person may need prayer, but the person may also need employment. A family may need hope, but it may also need housing. A community may need unity, but it may also need water, sanitation, roads, and public safety. A worker may need courage, but he may also need a union, legal protection, and a fair wage. A woman may need emotional support, but she may also need a shelter, legal assistance, and protection from an abuser. Spiritual support and practical action should not be enemies. They should stand together. A responsible church should pray with the hungry and then help provide food. It should comfort the unemployed and then help create training, networks, and opportunities. It should support victims of violence and then assist them in reaching safety. It should teach patience without demanding permanent surrender. It should teach forgiveness without hiding wrongdoing. It should teach hope without replacing public responsibility. There is a difference between endurance and submission. Endurance means carrying strength through hardship while working toward change. Submission means accepting the hardship as something that must never be challenged. Endurance can be courageous. Submission to injustice can be destructive. The people of Africa have endured enough. They endured slavery. They endured colonialism. They endured racial domination. They endured land dispossession. They endured forced labor. They endured apartheid. They endured governments that promised freedom and then betrayed the people through corruption. They have shown that they can survive. Now the question is whether survival will be turned into dignity. The powerful often praise the resilience of the poor. They say African people are strong. They say African women are strong. They say workers are strong. They say communities survive under difficult conditions. But strength should not become an excuse to keep people in suffering. A woman may be strong, but she should not have to survive violence. A child may be resilient, but that child should not have to study without food. A community may be united, but it should not have to organize every year for water that government should already provide. A worker may be courageous, but he should not risk his life for a wage that cannot support a family. Do not romanticize suffering. Do not turn survival into a beautiful story while refusing to remove the conditions that make survival necessary. The poor do not need to be praised for enduring what should have been changed. They need justice. They need power. They need access. They need their voices to matter before a crisis, not only after a tragedy. There is a message of control that says, remain silent, endure, and wait for your reward. There is another message, a message of liberation that says, keep your faith, but also stand up for your dignity, your rights, and your life. These messages may use similar religious words, but they lead in opposite directions. One protects the system, the other protects the human being. One tells the oppressed to become more obedient. The other tells the powerful to become more just. One sees suffering as a permanent condition. The other sees suffering as a call to action. That is the faith Africa needs. Not a faith that teaches people to accept every injustice. A faith that gives them the courage to confront injustice without losing their humanity. Not a faith that makes the poor ashamed of their anger. A faith that helps them turn anger into disciplined action. Not a faith that promises only a future reward. A faith that demands dignity in the present. Patience does not mean accepting injustice forever. Forgiveness does not mean refusing accountability. Humility does not mean surrendering your rights. Faith does not mean closing your eyes. The poor have been told to endure for too long. Now they must be told the truth. Their suffering is not always the result of spiritual weakness. Their poverty is not always evidence of personal failure. Their unemployment is not proof that they lack faith. Their demand for justice is not rebellion against God. Many of their struggles have political causes. They have economic causes. They have historical causes. And they require political, economic, and social solutions. This is the point where another form of manipulation appears. When leaders cannot explain unemployment, they call it a crisis of faith. When they cannot repair schools, they blame the discipline of the child. When they cannot create jobs, they tell the young to pray for favor. When they cannot provide health care, they describe illness as a spiritual punishment. When they cannot confront inequality, they blame individuals for lacking belief. The economic crisis is renamed as a spiritual crisis. Responsibility is moved away from institutions and placed upon the person who is suffering. That is the next deception we must expose. There is a dangerous habit that appears whenever leaders fail to solve real problems. They change the name of the problem. Unemployment becomes a lack of faith. Depression becomes demonic possession. Illness becomes punishment. Poverty becomes evidence that a person did not give enough. Business failure becomes a curse. Violence becomes only a problem of individual sin. And suddenly, the institutions that created or worsened the crisis disappear from the conversation. Government is no longer responsible. Parliament is no longer responsible. Business is no longer responsible. The banking system is no longer responsible. The education system is no longer responsible. The entire burden is placed on the person who is already suffering. I have seen young people wake before sunrise, prepare documents, travel long distances, and stand in lines hoping to find work. They apply again and again. They receive no answer. Some have qualifications, some have skills, some have experience, some are willing to do almost any honest work, but the economy does not create enough opportunities. Then someone tells them that they are unemployed because they lack faith. That accusation is cruel. A young person can pray every morning and still find no job if the economy is not creating jobs. A person can believe deeply and still remain unemployed when factories close, businesses fail, investment avoids poor communities, and the state cannot deliver economic growth. Faith may help that young person survive rejection. It may protect him from despair. It may remind him that his life has value. But faith cannot create a vacancy that does not exist. Prayer cannot replace economic planning. Worship cannot replace industrial policy. A sermon cannot replace investment in education, infrastructure, manufacturing, agriculture, technology, and small businesses. When the economy fails, we must not hide the failure behind spiritual language. In South Africa, unemployment has remained painfully high. The burden has not been distributed equally. Black South Africans have continued to face much higher levels of unemployment than white South Africans. That difference cannot be explained by saying one group prays more than another. It cannot be explained by saying one group has more faith. It cannot be explained only through individual choices. History matters. Education matters. Geography matters. Ownership matters. Access to capital matters. Transport matters. Networks matter. Racial inequality matters. The structure of the economy matters. A young person growing up in a poor settlement may live far from employment centers. Transport may consume a large part of any potential wage. The local school may lack teachers, laboratories, books, and digital access. The family may not have money for university or professional training. The young person may have no relative who can introduce him to an employer. Then he is told that success depends only on confidence and prayer. Confidence matters. Prayer may matter to him, but neither can erase the barriers placed in his path. When we deny those barriers, we protect the system that created them. We turn inequality into a personal failure. We make the victim feel ashamed. We tell him that everyone has the same opportunity when the evidence of his life tells him otherwise. That is not encouragement. It is deception. The same happens to mothers living on low wages. A woman may work every day. She may clean offices. She may sell food. She may care for children. She may work in a shop. She may take extra work whenever it becomes available. She may budget carefully. She may avoid unnecessary spending. She may pray with sincerity. But if her wage is too low, she will still struggle to pay for food, electricity, transport, school supplies, and rent. The problem is not that she lacks discipline. The problem may be that the wage does not match the cost of living. The problem may be that essential services are expensive. The problem may be that the state has failed to provide affordable housing and reliable public transport. The problem may be that employers benefit from labor that remains underpaid. Do not tell that woman that poverty proves she has failed spiritually. Do not tell her that she is poor because she did not give enough money to a church. Do not tell her that wealth is waiting if she simply makes one more sacrifice. Her struggle is not evidence that God has rejected her. It is evidence that the economy does not value every life equally. This manipulation becomes even more dangerous when it reaches illness. A person becomes sick. The family is afraid. They search for an explanation. Instead of being encouraged to seek medical help, they are told the illness is a punishment. They are told that a hidden sin caused the disease. They are told that someone placed a curse on the family. They are told that medicine shows a lack of faith. The patient begins to carry two burdens: the burden of illness and the burden of shame. That shame can prevent treatment. It can isolate the patient. It can destroy trust inside the family. It can turn a medical condition into a moral accusation. Illness is not always punishment. A disease is not proof that a person has sinned more than others. A child's condition is not evidence that the parents failed spiritually. A responsible religious leader should never make claims that increase suffering without evidence. He should pray if the family wants prayer. He should offer comfort. He should help the person reach proper care. He should never replace medical professionals with dangerous certainty. There is also the crisis of mental health. Too many people suffer in silence because depression, anxiety, trauma, and other conditions are described only as spiritual weakness. A person says he feels empty, he cannot sleep, he has lost hope, he struggles to get out of bed, he is told to pray harder. A woman experiences trauma after violence. She is told that she must simply forgive. A young person feels overwhelmed by unemployment, debt, and family pressure. He is told that negative thinking is blocking his blessing. Prayer may comfort some people. Faith communities may provide meaningful support, but mental suffering may also require trained professionals, safe spaces, treatment time, and honest conversation. Calling every mental health crisis demonic can stop people from seeking help. It can make them feel guilty for symptoms they did not choose. It can tell them that their pain proves spiritual failure. That is not compassion. Compassion begins by listening. It begins by admitting that human beings can be wounded in ways that are emotional, psychological, physical, social, and spiritual at the same time. One form of support does not have to cancel the others. A person can pray and receive therapy. A person can trust God and take medicine. A person can seek guidance from a pastor and still consult a doctor. Faith and professional care do not have to become enemies. The danger comes when one is used to block the other. There are also business owners who are told that every failure comes from a curse. A small business collapses because electricity is unreliable. Transport costs rise. Customers have less money. The bank refuses credit. Large companies dominate the market. Government payments are delayed. Corruption blocks access to opportunities. But instead of examining these economic conditions, someone tells the owner that a jealous relative has closed the business spiritually. The owner is told to buy a special prayer. He is told to attend a deliverance session. He is told to make an offering. The real causes remain unchanged. The electricity is still unreliable. The bank still refuses the loan. The government still delays payment. The market is still unequal, but money is taken from the struggling owner while he's searching for a miracle. That is how spiritual explanations can protect economic failure. They redirect anger away from institutions. They tell people to fight invisible enemies while visible systems remain untouched. They make citizens search for curses instead of demanding policy reform. They make workers search for demons instead of examining labor conditions. They make communities blame one another instead of following the money. I am not saying spiritual beliefs have no place in people's lives. Many Africans understand life through both material and spiritual experience. That reality must be treated with respect. But respect does not require abandoning reason. It does not require accepting every claim made by a person with a religious title. It does not require explaining every hardship through supernatural forces. A responsible society must examine evidence. It must ask practical questions. It must identify who made the decision. It must identify who benefited. It must identify which institution failed. It must identify which policy produced the outcome. Without those questions, accountability disappears. Consider education. A student may love God. The student may pray before every examination. The student may study with determination. But if the school has no qualified teachers, no textbooks, no laboratories, and no reliable electricity, the student has been placed at a disadvantage. If the classroom is overcrowded, the student receives less attention. If hunger makes concentration difficult, the student's performance is affected. If violence makes the journey to school unsafe, attendance becomes harder. If the family cannot afford internet access, the student falls behind others. Do not explain this failure by saying the child did not believe enough. The child did not design the education budget. The child did not appoint unqualified officials. The child did not steal money meant for school infrastructure. The child did not create inequality. Adults created those conditions. Institutions allowed them to continue. Those institutions must answer. This is where prayer can be misused by the state. A national tragedy occurs. Leaders call for prayer. A community loses children because of unsafe infrastructure. Leaders call for prayer. Violence increases. Leaders call for prayer. Corruption is exposed. Leaders call for prayer. Prayer may bring people together. It may honor the dead. It may provide comfort, but it must not become the final government response. After the prayer, who will investigate? Who will resign? Who will repair the building? Who will prosecute the thief? Who will change the policy? Who will protect the next child? Who will explain the budget? Who will ensure that the tragedy does not happen again? A government cannot replace administration with ceremony. It cannot replace competence with religious language. It cannot ask citizens to trust God when citizens are asking government officials to do their jobs. Public office comes with responsibility. That responsibility cannot be transferred to heaven. When roads collapse, officials must answer. When hospitals fail, officials must answer. When electricity becomes unreliable, officials must answer. When unemployment rises, economic leaders must answer. When corruption drains public resources, those responsible must face consequences. Faith may inspire honesty, but faith cannot be used to excuse dishonesty. Mmusi Maimane and I may approach this crisis from different directions. He may emphasize ethical leadership, civic responsibility, education, and the moral character of public institutions. I emphasize economic restructuring, land ownership, industrial development, and the distribution of resources. These positions are not identical, but both lead to an important conclusion. Prayer must never replace action by the state. A country needs moral leadership. It also needs material transformation. A government may have honest leaders and still fail if its policies do not change people's economic conditions. A government may introduce new economic policies and still fail if corruption destroys implementation. Ethics and structure must be addressed together. Honesty without capacity is not enough. Capacity without honesty becomes dangerous. Moral renewal without economic justice remains incomplete. Economic reform without accountability can become another opportunity for theft. That is why we cannot choose between moral responsibility and structural change. Africa needs both. We need leaders who do not steal. We also need systems that distribute opportunity fairly. We need citizens who participate. We also need institutions that respond. We need education that develops responsibility. We also need an economy capable of using the skills education creates. We need spiritual communities that support people. We also need public services that function. The crisis becomes dangerous when leaders use morality only to discipline the poor. They tell the unemployed to become responsible. They do not tell the corrupt minister to become responsible. They tell the young person to stop complaining. They do not tell the corporation to stop exploiting. They tell the mother to manage her money better. They do not ask why her wage is too low. They tell the community to protect public property. They do not prosecute the officials who stole the public budget. Responsibility must apply in every direction. The citizen has duties. The government has duties. The worker has duties. The employer has duties. The believer has duties. The religious leader has duties. No group should use morality to escape its own responsibilities. There is another reason economic problems are spiritualized. Spiritual explanations can be simple. Economic reality is complicated. It is easier to say a person is cursed than to explain unemployment. It is easier to blame sin than to explain inequality. It is easier to promise a miracle than to build a functioning school. It is easier to tell people to pray than to confront powerful business interests. It is easier to blame individual behavior than to reform a broken institution. But leadership is not supposed to choose the easiest explanation. Leadership must tell the truth, even when the truth is complicated. It must tell people that some problems require years of investment and organization. It must admit when policies have failed. It must correct mistakes. It must resist the temptation to offer religious language as a substitute for results. The people also have a responsibility to ask questions. When someone says unemployment is caused by a lack of faith, ask how many jobs were created. When someone says poverty is caused by insufficient giving, ask where the donations went. When someone says a community is cursed, ask what happened to the development budget. When someone says illness is punishment, ask for evidence. When someone says prayer alone will solve corruption, ask who will investigate and prosecute. Questions are not the enemy of faith. Questions are the enemy of manipulation. A truthful leader should not fear them. An honest government should not fear them. A responsible religious institution should not fear them. Only those who depend on confusion demand that people remain silent. I want Africans to pray if prayer gives them strength. I want them to worship freely. I want them to find hope in faith. But I also want them to read budgets. I want them to understand contracts. I want them to examine policies. I want them to know their rights. I want them to organize workers. I want them to study history. I want them to demand transparent government. I want them to challenge anyone who sells a spiritual explanation for a political failure. Faith should open the eyes. It should not close them. Prayer should give courage to confront reality. It should not become an escape from reality. A congregation should leave worship prepared to serve the community. It should not leave convinced that every national problem has already been solved because people prayed loudly. There is work to be done after the final amen. There are schools to repair. There are jobs to create. There are women to protect. There are patients to treat. There are corrupt officials to investigate. There are workers to defend. There are young people to train. There are businesses to support. There are institutions to rebuild. Prayer can accompany this work. It cannot replace the work. This is where we must distinguish between two forms of religious power. One form turns every crisis into personal guilt. The other helps people recognize their dignity and act together. One form protects those in control. The other stands beside those who are suffering. One form tells the poor that their condition proves spiritual failure. The other tells them that they deserve justice. One form demands silence. The other develops courage. One form makes the leader untouchable. The other makes every leader accountable. This distinction matters because religion in Africa has not always served oppression. It has also inspired resistance. It has protected communities. It has given moral language to struggles for freedom. It has produced leaders who stood before governments and refused to remain silent. The same faith that has been used to control people has also been used to liberate them. The question is not whether faith has power. The question is what kind of power it becomes. That is where we must go next. We must examine the difference between a religion that controls and a faith that liberates. Religion in Africa has not always stood beside oppression. It has also stood against it. That truth matters. Without it, this story would become unfair. It would treat every church as guilty. It would treat every religious leader as corrupt. It would ignore the believers who risked their safety, freedom, and lives in the struggle for justice. I will not do that. There were churches that opened their doors to activists. There were religious communities that fed families when workers were imprisoned. There were pastors who visited political detainees. There were believers who helped people escape violence. There were religious leaders who stood before apartheid and declared that racial domination was morally wrong. They did not use faith to protect power. They used faith to confront it. That is the difference between controlling religion and liberating faith. Controlling religion asks the poor to be silent. Liberating faith asks the powerful why the poor are suffering. Controlling religion protects the reputation of the leader. Liberating faith protects the dignity of the people. Controlling religion says authority must never be questioned. Liberating faith says every authority must answer to truth. Controlling religion creates fear. Liberating faith creates courage. This difference is not found only in words. It is found in action. Desmond Tutu did not stand before apartheid and tell black South Africans to accept oppression as the will of God. He used moral authority to expose the cruelty of the system. He spoke about dignity when the state denied dignity. He spoke about equality when racial law declared inequality. He spoke about reconciliation, but he did not pretend reconciliation could exist without truth. He showed that forgiveness should not erase memory. He showed that peace must not be confused with silence. He showed that religious leadership could stand before political power without kneeling to it. Alan Bosak also used theology as a language of resistance. He rejected the idea that religion should remain quiet while people were oppressed. He understood that a faith which speaks about justice in heaven but ignores injustice on earth has abandoned part of its responsibility. Bayers Naudé came from the Afrikaner religious tradition. He was surrounded by institutions that had used religious arguments to defend apartheid. But he chose another path. He rejected the comfort of silence. He challenged the system supported by many people from his own community. That choice came with a cost. This is important because moral courage is not proven when a person criticizes only his enemies. It is proven when he confronts injustice among his own allies. It is easy to condemn corruption in another party. It is harder to condemn corruption inside your own movement. It is easy to condemn another religion. It is harder to confront abuse inside your own church. It is easy to speak against foreign exploitation. It is harder to expose the local leader who helps that exploitation continue. Liberating faith demands that kind of honesty. Albert Luthuli was a political leader and a Christian. He did not see faith and resistance as enemies. He understood that human dignity could not be separated from political freedom. He became an example of a person whose religious convictions did not make him passive. They strengthened his commitment to justice. Outside Africa, Martin Luther King Jr. used Christian language to challenge segregation and racial oppression in the United States. He did not tell black Americans to wait quietly until the powerful decided to become generous. He spoke about love, but his love was not weak. It confronted unjust laws. It organized people. It marched. It demanded change. It accepted sacrifice without worshiping suffering. That is another important distinction. Liberating faith may require sacrifice, but it does not glorify suffering for its own sake. It does not tell people that pain is beautiful while refusing to remove the source of the pain. It does not tell the oppressed to love the oppressor by accepting oppression. It understands that love may require confrontation. It understands that truth may disturb peace before justice can create a better peace. During the struggle against apartheid, many religious communities supported families of political prisoners. They provided food. They offered shelter. They helped educate children. They cared for those left behind. They created places where people could gather when public organization was restricted. They gave moral language to resistance. They reminded people that the state did not have the final authority over human worth. These communities were not perfect. No institution is perfect, but their actions prove that religion does not have to become an instrument of control. It can become a source of protection. It can become a place where courage grows. It can become a voice for those ignored by political leaders. The question is not whether a religion uses the word justice. Almost every institution knows how to use beautiful words. The question is whether it accepts the cost of justice. Will it lose access to political leaders in order to tell the truth? Will it lose donations in order to expose exploitation? Will it protect a victim when doing so may damage the reputation of a famous leader? Will it stand beside workers when powerful companies become angry? Will it oppose racism even when racism benefits members of its own congregation? Will it challenge corruption when the corrupt politician is a friend? That is where the difference becomes visible. Controlling religion concentrates power in one person. Everything depends on the leader. The leader has the final interpretation. The leader controls the money. The leader decides who is loyal. The leader decides who is blessed. The leader decides who is an enemy. The congregation becomes dependent on his approval. Liberating faith does not build an untouchable human throne. It understands that every leader is limited. It creates structures of accountability. It allows questions. It shares responsibility. It accepts correction. It does not confuse the voice of one individual with the voice of God. Controlling religion punishes doubt. It tells people that asking questions is dangerous. It creates a community where fear is mistaken for respect. Liberating faith understands that sincere questions can deepen understanding. It does not demand blind obedience. It teaches people to examine what they are told. It recognizes that truth does not need intimidation. Controlling religion links wealth with holiness. The rich leader is described as blessed. The poor believer is told to improve his faith. Luxury becomes a spiritual symbol. Poverty becomes a moral accusation. Liberating faith rejects this cruelty. It does not judge a person's value by possessions. It does not treat a wealthy leader as spiritually superior to a poor worker. It understands that wealth may come from inheritance, opportunity, labor, exploitation, or luck. It understands that poverty may result from history, policy, unemployment, illness, inequality, or injustice. It refuses to turn economic status into a measure of moral worth. Controlling religion protects politicians. It gives them titles. It places them in front rows. It praises them publicly. It avoids difficult questions. It tells congregations to follow. Liberating faith does something different. It prays for leaders, but it also questions them. It respects public office, but it does not worship the office holder. It demands honesty. It demands service. It demands transparency. It remembers that political leaders are temporary. The people remain. Controlling religion asks women to submit while failing to protect them. It tells them to endure violence. It excludes them from leadership. It treats their questions as rebellion. It places the reputation of men above the safety of women. Liberating faith respects women as full human beings. It protects them from violence. It listens when they speak. It does not hide abuse. It does not use tradition as a weapon against their dignity. It understands that no community can claim moral strength, while women and children remain unsafe. Controlling religion divides Africans into camps. It teaches Christians to fear Muslims. It teaches Muslims to distrust Christians. It tells followers of traditional beliefs that they are inferior. It treats people without religion as enemies. It uses difference to build loyalty. Liberating faith does not require hatred. It allows people to believe deeply without denying the humanity of others. It understands that Christians, Muslims, followers of African traditional beliefs, and people with no religious affiliation can still work together for justice. They can oppose corruption together. They can defend workers together. They can protect women and children together. They can reject racism together. They can resist xenophobia together. They can build schools, clinics, and communities together. Africa cannot afford to waste its strength through religious division. Our problems do not ask which church we attend. Unemployment affects people across religions. Corruption steals from people across religions. Violence harms people across religions. Economic exploitation does not stop to ask how a worker prays. Poverty enters Christian homes. It enters Muslim homes. It enters homes that follow traditional beliefs. It enters homes without religion. Justice must therefore be larger than sectarian loyalty. I do not ask how you pray before I recognize your humanity. I ask what your faith does when a child is hungry. I do not ask how large your church is. I ask what that church does when a woman needs shelter. I do not ask how famous your pastor has become. I ask whether he is willing to challenge presidents, ministers, and billionaires. I do not ask how many people attend your service. I ask how the people are treated after the service ends. Are they stronger? Are they safer? Are they better informed? Are they able to question leadership? Do they understand where their money goes? Are children protected? Are women respected? Are the sick encouraged to receive proper care? Are the poor served without humiliation? These are the questions that reveal the character of an institution. A religion that is brave only before the poor, but silent before the powerful, is not courageous. It is selective. A preacher who shouts at an unemployed mother but whispers before a corrupt minister is not defending morality. He's defending hierarchy. A church that publicly judges the clothing of young people but refuses to discuss stolen public money has chosen the easier enemy. A religious leader who condemns private sin but remains silent about economic exploitation has reduced morality to personal behavior. Justice must examine both the individual and the system. A person can act dishonestly. A system can also be dishonest. A person can steal. A contract can also steal. A person can exploit. A company can also exploit. A person can lie. A government can build an entire administration on lies. Liberating faith has the courage to name both. This is why transparency matters. A religious organization that asks people for money must explain how the money is used. It should have clear governance. It should have proper accounts. It should have independent oversight. Community donations should not become the personal property of the leader. The organization should not depend completely on one family. Leaders should not appoint only people who will never challenge them. Financial transparency is not an attack on religion. It is a form of protection. It protects the believer from exploitation. It protects the honest leader from suspicion. It protects community resources. It shows that spiritual authority is not being used to hide private enrichment. A liberating religious community also invests in education. It does not fear knowledge. It does not discourage people from reading beyond one source. It does not treat science as an enemy. It does not tell young people that every question shows a lack of faith. It helps people understand history. It teaches them about Africa before colonialism. It teaches them about resistance. It teaches them about the contributions of African women. It teaches local languages. It helps people understand the economy, the law, health, and citizenship. An educated believer is not a threat to honest faith. An educated believer is a threat to manipulation. That is why controlling systems often fear education. They do not want followers to compare claims with evidence. They do not want them to understand financial records. They do not want them to know their legal rights. They do not want them to recognize emotional abuse. They do not want them to see that the leader's authority depends on fear. Liberating faith does the opposite. It equips people. It gives them knowledge. It encourages responsibility. It does not create permanent dependence. A strong leader should want the community to become stronger than the leader. A teacher should want students to think independently. A pastor should want believers to develop judgment. A political leader should want citizens to understand government. A parent should want children to stand on their own. Control fears maturity. Liberation produces maturity. There is another important test. What happens when the religious organization makes a mistake? Controlling religion denies everything. It blames critics. It threatens those who speak. It hides documents. It protects the leader. It describes every investigation as persecution. Liberating faith admits wrongdoing. It apologizes. It repairs what can be repaired. It removes people who abused authority. It cooperates with lawful investigation. It changes structures that allowed abuse to happen. It understands that confession without consequence is not accountability. No institution proves its integrity by claiming it has never failed. Integrity is revealed by how it responds when failure is exposed. The same is true in politics. A party should not defend every member simply because that person wears the party's colors. A movement that protects corruption will eventually lose its purpose. A government that refuses correction will eventually serve itself. A church that cannot admit wrongdoing will eventually become more concerned with survival than truth. Truth must be greater than the institution. The people must be greater than the leader. Justice must be greater than reputation. This is the kind of faith that can help liberate Africa. Not a faith owned by politicians. Not a faith controlled by celebrity preachers. Not a faith that humiliates African identity. Not a faith that replaces medicine, education, or public policy. Not a faith that sells miracles. A faith that serves, a faith that questions, a faith that protects, a faith that educates, a faith that stands beside the oppressed, a faith that challenges greed, a faith that accepts accountability, a faith that does not fear other religions, a faith that refuses to become a political campaign office. The objective is not to destroy belief. The objective is to return belief to justice, truth, and responsibility. The objective is not to close churches. The objective is to open the eyes of the people inside them. The objective is not to silence religious leaders. The objective is to demand that their voices remain independent from money and political power. The objective is not to remove faith from African life. The objective is to remove faith from the hands of those who use it as a weapon of control. But this cannot remain only a moral argument. Africa needs practical action. We must change how religious organizations are governed. We must protect people from false healing claims. We must defend women and children. We must teach African history. We must stop political parties from owning the pulpit. We must ask, who owns the land, mines, banks, energy, and technology? We must build religious institutions that serve communities instead of glorifying individuals. We must unite Africans across religious lines. And above all, we must restore the right to question. That is where the final item begins. It is not enough to identify the chains. We must explain how to break them. We must liberate the mind. We must liberate the church. And we must liberate the African economy. It is not enough to identify manipulation. It is not enough to expose false prophets. It is not enough to criticize politicians who use religion for votes. It is not enough to speak about colonial history, stolen land, unequal contracts, unemployment, and poverty. People cannot live forever inside diagnosis. At some point, we must move from anger to action. We must decide what must change. We must decide who must take responsibility. We must decide what kind of religious institutions, political systems, and economies we want to leave to the next generation. Liberation is not only the removal of chains. Liberation is the construction of something better after the chains are removed. Africa needs to liberate the mind. Africa needs to liberate religious institutions. Africa needs to liberate the economy. These struggles are connected. A person who is afraid to question a religious leader may also be afraid to question a politician. A citizen who does not understand where church donations go may also fail to ask where public money goes. A community taught to accept every hardship as the will of God may also accept economic exploitation as permanent. That is why the right to question stands at the center of liberation. The first step must be financial transparency. Religious organizations that receive large amounts of money from the public must be willing to explain how that money is used. They must publish financial reports. They must create clear structures of governance. They must establish proper systems of auditing. They must separate community donations from the personal wealth of religious leaders. A church is not a private company belonging to one individual. A congregation is not a customer base. An offering is not a personal salary unless proper structures have openly approved it. The people have the right to know. They have the right to ask how much money entered the institution. They have the right to ask how much was spent on community work. They have the right to ask who owns the buildings, vehicles, land, and other property. They have the right to know whether donations support the poor or the lifestyle of the leader. Transparency does not destroy trust. Secrecy destroys trust. When money is handled honestly, leaders should not fear independent oversight. An honest religious institution should welcome clear accounting. It should understand that accountability protects everyone. It protects the congregation. It protects the organization. It protects sincere leaders from false accusations. And it makes it more difficult for dishonest leaders to hide exploitation behind sacred language. We must also end the abuse of medicine and false healing promises. No religious leader should prevent a person from going to a hospital. No preacher should tell a patient to stop taking necessary medicine. No self-proclaimed healer should promise to cure a serious disease without evidence. No one should make money by selling certainty to a frightened family. Faith can stand beside medicine. Prayer can stand beside treatment. A religious community can support a patient emotionally and spiritually, but it must never place the patient in danger. There must be consequences for those who knowingly make harmful medical claims. There must be public education. People must understand that seeking medical help is not a betrayal of faith. Taking medicine is not spiritual weakness. Consulting a doctor is not disbelief. A person can pray and still follow professional medical advice. The two do not have to be enemies. The next responsibility is the protection of women and children. This cannot be negotiated. Every allegation of violence, exploitation, or abuse must be taken seriously. It must not be hidden inside private meetings. It must not be settled in secret to protect the reputation of an institution. It must not be silenced through threats, prayer, shame, or pressure. Where a crime may have occurred, law enforcement must be involved. The safety of the victim comes first, not the reputation of the leader, not the size of the congregation, not the political connections of the institution, not the embarrassment of the family. A church, mosque, or traditional community loses moral credibility when it protects an alleged offender while silencing the vulnerable. No title should place a person above the law. No spiritual claim should prevent an investigation. No organization should be allowed to treat abuse as an internal public relations problem. A society that cannot protect women and children cannot call itself free. We must also restore African history to education. For too long, generations of African children have learned more about conquest than about the civilizations that existed before conquest. They have learned the names of those who divided Africa. They have learned too little about those who built Africa, defended Africa, and imagined Africa beyond colonial control. Schools must teach pre-colonial history. They must teach African civilizations. They must teach the history of resistance to slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. They must teach the contribution of African women. They must teach African philosophy, science, agriculture, art, trade, governance, and spirituality. They must teach the ideas of liberation thinkers. They must teach local languages as languages of dignity and knowledge. This education should not exist only in schools. Religious communities must also participate. A church in Africa should understand the history of the people it serves. A mosque in Africa should understand the local community beyond the walls of worship. A traditional institution should preserve knowledge while remaining open to questions and human rights. Education should help Africans understand that history did not begin with colonization. Africa existed before the colonial map. African people thought, built, traded, governed, healed, created, and believed before foreign powers arrived. Knowing this does not require rejecting the rest of the world. It creates the confidence to meet the world as an equal. A child who knows where he comes from is less likely to believe that dignity must be imported. We must also prevent the pulpit from becoming the headquarters of a political party. Religious institutions have the right to speak about justice, They have the right to discuss corruption, poverty, violence, racism, inequality, and public morality. They should not be silent. But there is a difference between speaking about justice and ordering believers to support one political candidate. A religious leader should not threaten the conscience of a voter. A congregation should not be treated as a voting bloc owned by one person. No politician should be presented as the only candidate acceptable to God. The church must be able to question every government. It cannot do that honestly when it becomes dependent on one party. A religious institution that turns into a campaign office loses its independence. It becomes unable to confront the same leaders it helped place in power. The people must remain free to listen, think, compare, and vote according to conscience. The ballot belongs to the citizen, not the pastor, not the bishop, not the imam, not the prophet, not the political leader. Religious organizations must protect this freedom. Africa must then confront the question that powerful people avoid. Who owns the land? Who owns the banks? Who owns the mines? Who controls energy? Who owns the technology? Who benefits from natural resources? How much value remains on the continent? How much leaves? These are not questions of jealousy. They are questions of power. A nation may hold elections and still remain economically dependent. It may have a constitution and still lack control over strategic resources. It may replace one president with another while ownership remains untouched. Political democracy without meaningful economic participation creates frustration. People are told they are free, but they cannot find work. They cannot afford land. They cannot start businesses. They cannot access capital. They watch wealth move around them without entering their lives. This contradiction will not disappear through prayer alone. It requires policy. It requires organization. It requires education. It requires honest leadership. It requires a long-term plan for ownership, industrialization, technology, and production. Africa must not only extract. Africa must process. Africa must manufacture. Africa must build. Africa must invent. Africa must keep more value within African communities. A mine should not become a hole in the ground surrounded by poverty. An oil field should not produce darkness for the people living beside it. Agricultural land should not produce food for the rich, while local children remain hungry. Energy resources should not enrich a small group while households remain without electricity. The wealth beneath the soil must improve life above the soil. That is the purpose of economic liberation. It is not the replacement of one small elite by another. It is not the transfer of wealth to politically connected individuals. It is not corruption wearing the language of transformation. It is the building of broad ownership. It is the creation of jobs. It is the development of skills. It is support for local producers. It is the growth of industry. It is the protection of workers. It is the transparent use of public resources. It is the ability of future generations to inherit functioning institutions, not slogans. Religious communities can play a practical role in this work. Instead of investing only in larger stages, brighter lights, and more expensive sound systems, they can invest in communities. They can build kitchens that feed hungry families. They can create classrooms. They can offer vocational training. They can create shelters for women escaping violence. They can provide legal support. They can establish mental health programs. They can create transparent scholarship funds. They can help young people prepare job applications. They can support small businesses. They can provide spaces where communities discuss budgets, rights, and public policy. A place of worship should not become a substitute for government, but it can become a center of service. It can help people survive. It can help them learn. It can help them organize. It can help them reach institutions that often appear distant or hostile. This is what leadership looks like when it moves beyond spectacle. The true strength of a church is not measured by the height of the stage. It is measured by how deeply the institution serves the people around it. The true strength of a leader is not measured by how many people obey him. It is measured by how many people become stronger because of his leadership. We must also build African unity across religious lines. Christians, Muslims, followers of African traditional beliefs, and people with no religious affiliation must be able to work together. They do not need to agree on every theological question. They do not need to worship in the same way. They do not need to abandon their beliefs. But they must recognize common responsibilities. They can fight corruption together. They can defend workers together. They can protect women and children together. They can oppose racism together. They can confront xenophobia together. They can demand honest government together. They can defend African sovereignty together. The person suffering from unemployment does not become less unemployed because he belongs to one religion. The woman facing violence does not become safer because people debate theology around her. The child studying in a broken school does not receive books because adults argue about which community owns the truth. Africa has urgent work to do. Religious division must not become another weapon used to weaken us. We must reject the idea that one group must dominate another before justice can exist. A society can protect religious freedom while also protecting people from abuse. It can respect belief while demanding accountability. It can preserve tradition while rejecting harmful practices. It can allow deep disagreement without turning disagreement into hatred. Unity does not mean uniformity. It means cooperation around shared human dignity. But none of these reforms will succeed unless we restore the right to question. Every believer must have the right to ask where the money goes. Every member must have the right to ask who appoints the leader. Every community must have the right to ask what relationship exists between the religious institution and political figures. Every follower must have the right to ask why a leader lives in luxury while the congregation remains poor. Every woman must have the right to ask why a teaching is used to demand silence from her. Every young person must have the right to compare what is preached with what is practiced. Questions are not betrayal. Questions are protection. Questions prevent one person from becoming more powerful than the institution. Questions prevent fear from replacing truth. Questions expose the distance between public words and private behavior. Questions make accountability possible. A leader who is honest should not fear them. A belief that is true should not collapse because someone asks for evidence. An institution that serves the people should not punish those who seek transparency. When questions are forbidden, abuse is already near. The same right to question must apply in politics. Citizens must ask where the public money went. They must ask who received the contract. They must ask why a project failed. They must ask who benefited from a policy. They must ask why the same communities remain poor after decades of promises. They must ask why officials become wealthy while public services collapse. Voting is important, but citizenship does not begin and end on election day. Democracy requires attention between elections. It requires public meetings. It requires free media. It requires strong institutions. It requires community organization. It requires citizens who understand that leaders work for them. No politician is greater than the people. No party owns the state. No movement should become a shelter for corruption. No leader should be protected simply because he claims to represent a historic struggle. History deserves respect, but history must not become immunity. A liberation movement can lose its purpose. A religious movement can lose its purpose. An institution can begin by serving the people and end by serving itself. That is why every generation must examine leadership again. We must judge leaders by what they do now, not only by the language they inherit, not only by the struggle they claim, not only by the sacred titles they carry. Liberation also requires personal courage. Institutions must change. Policies must change. Leadership must change. But ordinary people must also refuse the comfort of silence. They must speak when money is misused. They must protect victims. They must refuse to follow instructions that violate conscience. They must resist the pressure to treat powerful humans as sacred. They must teach children to ask respectful but serious questions. They must understand that fear is one of the strongest tools of control. The false prophet says questioning him will bring a curse. The politician says questioning him will divide the nation. The corporation says demanding justice will destroy investment. The foreign power says independence will create instability. Every form of power creates a reason why it should not be challenged. But freedom begins when people examine those warnings. Sometimes the danger is real. Change can be difficult. Institutions can resist. Powerful people can retaliate. But permanent submission also has a cost. It creates generations who inherit poverty. It creates institutions that never learn. It creates leaders who believe they are untouchable. It creates communities that mistake fear for peace. There's no painless road to dignity. But dignity is worth the struggle. I do not stand before you to declare war on God. I stand against those who use the name of God to become rich from the tears of the poor. I do not ask Africans to burn churches. I ask them to open their eyes when they enter them. I do not ask people to abandon faith. I ask them to abandon the fear that prevents them from questioning human beings. No pastor is greater than truth. No prophet is greater than the safety of a child. No bishop is greater than accountability. No politician is greater than the people. No corporation is greater than the law. No foreign power owns the future of Africa. For too long, Africans have been told to ask those who took from them to become kinder. We have asked for fairer contracts. We have asked for more aid. We have asked for investment. We have asked corrupt leaders to remember the poor. We have asked exploitative employers to respect workers, but asking alone will not transform power. We must organize. We must study. We must produce. We must own. We must protect our resources. We must develop technology. We must build strong institutions. We must educate the next generation. We must create systems in which no individual can control everything. We must build an Africa where faith does not force people to kneel before oppression. Faith should give them the courage to stand upright before injustice. The day Africans understand that God did not create them to become servants in their own countries, every throne built on fear will begin to shake. Faith is not supposed to be a chain. Faith should be a source of strength. Africa does not need more self-appointed saviors. Africa needs citizens who think. It needs workers who are respected. It needs leaders who accept responsibility. It needs religious communities brave enough to stand beside truth. It needs governments that serve. It needs businesses that create value without destroying dignity. It needs unity that does not erase difference. It needs hope that leads to action. I am Julius Malema, and I say that the time has come to liberate the land. The time has come to liberate the economy. The time has come to liberate the mind. And the time has come to liberate faith itself from the hands of those who transformed it into an instrument of control. But after speaking these words, I was left with one final question. What remains when the speech is over? What remains when the crowd goes home? What remains when the anger becomes quiet? The answer is responsibility. Because a better Africa will not be built by speeches alone. It will be built by what we choose to do after we have heard the truth. After that conversation, I thought deeply about everything I had said and everything the world is still experiencing today. I realized that although we come from different nations, carry different beliefs, and speak different languages, human beings are searching for the same things: dignity, justice, truth, and hope. For many years, I have watched systems of power rise and fall. I have heard great promises that never changed the daily lives of ordinary people. I have seen leaders speak about freedom while families remained trapped in poverty, fear, and inequality. And I've learned that no country can truly call itself strong while its people are still hungry, unsafe, unemployed, and powerless. Real change does not begin only inside parliaments, presidential offices, churches, or international conferences. It begins when ordinary people decide to live according to conscience. It begins when someone refuses to remain silent before injustice. It begins when a worker demands dignity. It begins when a woman refuses to return to violence. It begins when a believer asks where the money went. It begins when a citizen questions a politician who has forgotten the people. I hope future generations will build a world more just than the one we have inherited. A world where human beings are respected for their value, not their status. A world where unity is stronger than division. A world where compassion is stronger than greed. A world where faith protects the vulnerable instead of protecting the powerful. The road ahead will not be easy, but I still believe that people who defend their dignity, organize around truth, and stand together can change their destiny. Hope does not belong only to those waiting for a miracle. Hope belongs to those who refuse to stop building a better future. I am Julius Malema, and I believe Africa's future will not be decided by those who exploit its fear. It will be decided by people who think, question, organize, create, and stand together. If you also believe in a more just and humane future, leave a message of courage and continue walking with us as we carry this hope to others.